I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar, The Basics of Pond Management. My name is Lee Bridgman, and I am a program assistant in Ag and Horticulture in Queen Anne's County, Maryland. I'll be facilitating the session. Throughout the presentation, we'll be using the chat pad for questions, so please use the select the everyone and type your question in, and the presenter will answer your question as soon as they're able. Before we begin, I would like to thank our sponsors and collaborators listed on the screen, and also remind you that you can go to the link that I put in the chat, go.umd.edu Women in Ag Webinars, to see the recorded sessions that we've done before. We will be sending out the archive session to you, and you can feel free to share that with anyone you would like, and that would be wonderful. Complete collection is on the website. Now, I would like to turn the presentation over to Andy Lazur to talk about the basics of pond management.
Very good. Thank you, Lee, and hello, everybody. As Lee said, I'm going to go ahead and present an overview, some basics of pond management. And I think it's important to note that there are a lot of different types of ponds. Let me go ahead and, for some reason, it's not advancing. Let's try this. There we go. So there's lots of different ponds, but there's also, even though there's a lot of difference in ponds, there's a lot of similarities too. And those similarities relate to the pond ecology and some of the problems that we see. And fortunately, also, regardless of the type of pond and what you use it for, there are some basic management practices that we can employ to get the most out of a pond, whatever your desired use. So again, they're used for a lot of different purposes in the agricultural community. A lot of times they were originally designed for soil conservation and irrigation purposes. But again, it's an asset that's out there. It can be used for stormwater management, fish production, wildlife habitat, various forms of recreation. And it's important to note then that what your desired use of that pond will influence the management. So for example, you may have a spring-fed pond that has high flow through your pond, and that may influence the water quality, certainly. Or you may have just a large watershed, and you may have different types of inputs on that watershed, whether it be nutrients, fertilizer, even soil, that will influence the water quality of the pond and may interfere with the use that you have. So again, when we looked at a pond, it's very important to note that the water quality is influenced, as I said earlier, by the watershed, but also the soil that the water comes in contact with, whether it's running off the watershed or just the pond bottom itself. That soil has certain chemistry, and since the water and soil are interacting together, it will obviously influence the water quality. So for example, if you have a pond on a high limestone area soil, you would expect your hardness, your water hardness, that's the measure of calcium and magnesium, to be elevated, even in your alkalinity, which I'll talk a little bit about. And alkalinity is basically just the amount of carbonate bases in the water, and it's important because it can buffer the pH swing in a pond. But you have these different inputs, you have the different soil characteristics, and therefore you have different water quality. And it's also important to note that a pond is dynamic. It's an ecosystem. Things are constantly changing, and whether that be the rainfall that's coming in or flow through, temperature swings, all this influence the water quality, but also influences the ecosystem itself. So here's some important parameters when we talk about water quality. We're concerned about Oxygen, certainly. Temperature will influence a lot of things. pH is, most people are familiar with all that, but there's other things like some of the nitrogen compounds and phosphorus, and I mentioned alkalinity. So again, a pond is an ecosystem, and there's a lot of activity going on there. And this is just a representation of a typical pond, just to show you several features. We have nutrients in soil that can be, washed in from the watershed. We could have a geese population that's contributing nitrogen to it. And anytime you have nutrients and sunlight, the aquatic plants will grow. And in this case, here we have phytoplankton, and there's literally hundreds of species of phytoplankton. It gives it the green color in ponds, and that's actually a beneficial thing. So aquatic plants in a pond provide a lot of benefits in that they produce oxygen because they're photosynthesizing just like any green plant. And so that's helping the water quality. But again, if you have excessive nutrients, you can also have excessive plant growth, and that could interfere with your uses, for example. So if you're irrigating out of the pond and you have a lot of, say, filamentous algae growth because of high nutrients, that can clog your filter. Or if you're using it for recreational fishing or swimming, whatever the case may be, if you have a lot of plant growth, that may interfere with that use. But again, it's important to note that these aquatic plants, whatever they are producing oxygen, but they're also taking up nutrients. So they are a biofilter, if you will, a natural biofilter. But many plants, and particularly phytoplankton, is constantly growing and dying. And when it dies, it will settle down to the bottom, and older ponds tend to get a lot of organic matter buildup over time. And it could be just algae that's dying off, or you could have an influx of, say, leaf material, leaf litter that's coming in and adding to this organic layer on the bottom. And the challenge with that is that this organic layer is constantly releasing nutrients into the water column. So again, typical pond management practice is to try to, reduce the amount of nutrients coming into a pond. And if you happen to have your pond on your farm, for example, and you're actually interested in growing fish, whether that's for recreational fishing or, for fish consumption purposes, then you might actually be feeding your pond to help grow fish. And that's, again, you have to just take into account that what you're hoping for is a balance. So a little bit about water quality, particularly oxygen. It's important to note, as I mentioned, that it's a dynamic situation, and you get a lot of fluctuations in water quality. And typically oxygen is a classic example, because due to photosynthesis during the daylight hours, your oxygen levels are going to be higher. And this just kind of graphically shows that the lowest point of oxygen is early in the morning, and then you get photosynthesis, and it rises and generally tends to peak, late afternoon. But it's also important to note that these aquatic plants are both producing oxygen, but they're also respiring. And so during the nighttime hours, your oxygen levels will go down. So if you have fish in your pond, and if you've ever seen fish up at the surface, quote, gasping for air, it's typically, at this low point here in early morning hours. So one of the management practices is to add an aerator, for example. But it's also, important to note that this phytoplankton population here, the extent of that green color is important. This is a little device we use just to kind of get an estimate of the concentration of phytoplankton. So a little bit of green color is a good thing. What you don't want is so many nutrients going into the pond that you end up with a very dark, almost like a pea soup type of situation, because you'll get a lot of oxygen production during the day, but you're going to get a lot of oxygen consumption during the nighttime hours. And so that's when you can run into some issues with fish stress or even fish kills. So it goes back to that old adage, a little bit of something is good. Too much can be a bad thing. So that's also true with aquatic plants. And then again, just adding a little bit more about the oxygen cycling events that happen is that it's dependent upon sunlight. And so, you know, if you have good sunlight activities, you get this normal kind of swing. You get a couple of cloudy days, and those oxygen levels, particularly early in the morning, can be reduced. So a storm or clouds that can last several days can influence the oxygen concentration in that pond over time. And I mentioned this earlier that, you know, again, it just shows another representation of the dynamics of a pond ecosystem, and those dynamics are influencing various water quality parameters. Just talked about oxygen. Here's pH cycling, tends to be lowest in the early morning hours, and then it peaks in the early afternoon. So it sort of follows the oxygen cycle, and it's actually related to the plant growth because, as you might know, in order for plants to grow, they are actually taking up carbon dioxide and taking it out of the water, in this case in a pond environment, and then they're also producing oxygen. But when you have a lot of CO2 in the water, CO2 is carbon dioxide is an acid in water, so that will drop the pH. So as your algae is taking up carbon dioxide, it's actually elevating the pH over time. So again, just a little bit more information about the dynamics of a pond. And it's so important to talk about aquatic plants because, you know, I mentioned some of the benefits already and how they influence not only oxygen production, but other water quality parameters, but they serve other benefits as well. I mentioned that they're taking up nutrients, so they're a biofilter. They can also even trap some of the sediment. They provide habitat for fish and other aquatic life. And certainly they're very important in erosion control. So to have some vegetative cover on your pond banks is important. Otherwise, you're going to get a lot of clay turbidity in your pond, and that can influence the water quality. But again, and this is where I get calls most of the time on pond management has to do with heavy infestation of certain types of aquatic plants. So there are some drawbacks. Certainly, dependent upon the use of the pond, there could be, you know, interference with the use, say fishing or swimming. In some cases, some of these aquatic plants, if they get excessive, can actually become unsightly and even create some odor issues. So again, it's trying to maintain a balance. You do want some aquatic plants, and you'll have some. Every pond is going to have some aquatic plant, whether it be phytoplankton or emergent species, and we'll talk more about that. But again, a lot of the pond management practices have, you know, deal with aquatic plant management. So speaking of that, there are several types of aquatic plants. We have floating. I've already talked about the phytoplankton algae here, and then we have submerged. Submerged, these are plants that are rooted to the bottom, emergent species, and again, just a variety. And I'm going to show you a couple of these. So we talked about the algae. This is the phytoplankton here on the upper right, and then filamentous algae. This is where I get a lot of calls from pond owners. I've got this mat of, you know, long stringy plant material. You know, what is it? And you can see on the bottom right, just, you know, this is a heavy infestation and how that could interfere with various uses. So again, they're very common, and they can die off. And when these mats sort of die off, they can create some intensive odor issues, but also can create an oxygen demand and may cause some issues with fish stress, if not, you know, actually causing mortality of fish. And then you may be familiar with some of the floating plants. A common one is duckweed here on the bottom. And it's a very small plant, and it can cover, again, with the adequate nutrients can really cover a lot of the pond. I've seen ponds completely covered with duckweed, or I've seen instances where there's just a little bit of duckweed and the wind can blow it to one side or the other. There's another one, water hyacinth, which is actually a non-native invasive. But again, these are not anchored and they will move around. Just like any aquatic plant, they're there because sunlight's there and nutrients. So, nutrients are so important in so many aspects. I know we do so much great work to reduce nutrient impact on surface waters and pond the same way. We have issues with nutrients and pond water quality. And then there's submerged plants. Again, these are the plants that are rooted. And typically you're going to see these plants where you have clear water. So a crystal clear pond is not necessarily a good thing, particularly if it's, on a farm or, even a stormwater pond, whatever the case may be. It's good to have a little bit of green phytoplankton color because it helps shade out some of these other species of plants. Again, these species are providing some benefit as far as habitat, even food for certain wildlife. But again, too much of a thing where it's actually, interfering with the use is the challenge. But Elodea, coontail, hydrilla is a non-native, for example. But again, they're rooted to the bottom. They're there because they can attain nutrients and they're getting sunlight. Okay. Again, some of these species can be very problematic, and to where there's, high interference with any sort of use in the pond, whether it be irrigation, pumping, swimming, fishing, whatever the case may be. Then we have marginal plants. These are along the shoreline. Common one is Phragmites here on the bottom, but there's many others. Cattail, can be very invasive. And it's, again, a shoreline or marginal species. They're rooted. Oftentimes they'll spread through rhizomes. Typically, you'll see these in that, up to about 3 feet in a pond. And again, a little bit of it is no issue. It's just when they spread to where they're interfering with whatever desired use you have. And they can be controlled, and we'll talk a little bit about that, some of the measures on that. So these are my kind of top 10 list of the problems that when I get calls from various types of pond owners. We've talked about several of these. Duckweed, filamentous algae probably are the top ones, or planktonic algae, the phytoplankton. Where we have a lot of nutrients coming in, and they don't want that intense green, I call it pea soup, really thick algae population. But again, a couple of others. And again, as I said earlier, some of these, all these species, with the exception of hydrilla, which is invasive and non-native, I mean, again, they do provide some benefit. It's just a question of that balance. Are they excessive for the desired use? So control methods, like so many things, if you can prevent them from the beginning, that's the best way to do it. And the two key points there are to reduce nutrient input. So whatever's going on in your watershed, try to reduce the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus coming in. And that can be done by actually using some beneficial plants, using some plant buffers, maybe not mowing the grass or the turf, around the perimeter of the pond too short, maintaining some plant, or actually just planting specific plants. And a little bit more on that in just a minute. There's mechanical removal, but again, you can imagine some of the pictures I showed earlier with a heavy infestation. It's virtually impossible. Although there are companies that have equipment, special equipment, that can actually harvest, physically remove the plant material. But again, anytime you're removing vegetation, whether it be mechanically or chemically through herbicides, you have to understand that they're there for a reason, and they'll come back unless you get back to some, reducing the amount of nutrients entering the pond. Biological, we don't really have a lot of in our tool bag here in Maryland. A lot of other states can use grass carp, sterile grass carp, which actually feed on a lot of species of algae, but they're not legal here in Maryland. And then, so that, again, if we can't remove it mechanically, then the option may be the use of herbicides. So these are some common problems that I see all the time. Again, I see different types of ponds, stormwater ponds, farm ponds, irrigation ponds, things like that. But these are very typical situation. This upper left is a stormwater pond with a heavy infestation of cattails. And the homeowners in this community actually wanted, in fact, you don't see it on the screen, but they have like a little park bench, and they wanted to be able to see the pond environment. Some of the ponds have aerators and things like that. And, the cattails were so tall and so thick that they really couldn't enjoy the pond. The one on the upper right here is a classic example of algae or algal scums forming. And you can see the different color here. This white color is actually where the algal mat has been bleached by the sun and is dying off. This particular pond not only was unsightly, but it was having some odor issues as well. And here on the bottom left, we see again another typical situation where we have a pretty heavy infestation of filamentous algae. And then another issue that we see is fish die off. And you can actually look at this water, and it's pretty dark. It has kind of a greenish brown color, but it's a pretty thick algae bloom. And that may have been the big issue in this particular pond. There's some other algae, other aquatic plants in here, but again, unfortunately, it resulted in a fish die off because of excessive nutrients in plant growth and those swings in oxygen that I showed earlier. So this is just this is a publication that we have out, and although it's urban and stormwater pond in the title, the information in here has a lot of good information about pond management practices. It also has a list of beneficial plants that can be used and how they can be used. Again, what you're trying to do is to use some shoreline plants and even plants in the water that are beneficial, that can help take up excessive nutrients, and so kind of rob nutrients away from the unwanted vegetation. So it is this balance, and it sometimes takes a long time with heavy infestations of undesired plant growth. It may take a couple of strategies, one being, maybe several herbicide applications over time in combination with reducing nutrients coming into the pond, and maybe planting a plant buffer, for example, or maybe even some planting some of these species of plants to help, again, to take the nutrients from the bad and give it to the good plants, if you will. So again, this is not rocket science or nothing new. We've been talking about riparian buffers for years, and it's a common practice, obviously, to again utilize natural vegetation, trees, other vegetation, shrubs, even turf to manage nutrient inflow off the watershed. And then here on the upper right is just an example of using desired aquatic species, plant species, to provide a buffer, if you will. So as water of nutrients and even soil kind of runs off this turf, it's being trapped by these beneficial plants. And this was about a 3-foot strip that was just planted along part of the pond perimeter. Again, this is a urban pond, and so they were trying to maximize the aesthetic value of the pond and wildlife value, because these, this is creating some pollinator habitat, which again is not only benefiting wildlife, but it's also taking up some nutrients and I guess, basically preventing it or reducing the amount of nutrients that go into the pond. And then there's another technology that's used, a variety of this. Here's, again, the strategy of using some beneficial plants to take nutrients away from unwanted. This pond used to have a lot of issues with filamentous algae, gnats, and things like that. And through a couple of management practices, including some herbicide treatment, and then adding some beneficial shoreline vegetation, and they also added these floating wetlands. Again, this is an urban pond, and it's there for aesthetic value as well as habitat. So again, there's different strategies, but the idea again is to use plants to reduce the amount of nutrients going into the pond. So here's some a list of basic practices in addition to what I've talked a little bit about. It's always good to know what's going on with your pond, know your watershed. What are the uses of that watershed? What are the nutrient uses on that watershed? And then the water inflow. Do you have a flow-through pond? A flow-through pond, especially if it's excessive flow, can be difficult to manage aquatic plants in because, again, if you're adding a herbicide, then it's going downstream, and you want to avoid that. Minimal flow, like a small spring, that's typically easy to work with. Again, we talked about reducing nutrients, and then also testing your water. If you can understand some of the basics, like your alkalinity and hardness, pH, that will help to understand what is going on with the watershed and the pond soil, what contribution, what sort of minerals you have in there, but also these parameters, particularly alkalinity, is important to know when you plan on using herbicides. So certain herbicides, like the copper compounds, can be very toxic to fish with waters of low alkalinity, low being, under 40 parts per million. So again, it's, again, knowing what's going on, knowing your pond will help you understand, how to manage your pond. If you have geese, don't encourage them by feeding. If you are trying to grow fish for consumption, then you certainly don't want to overfeed, because feed is nutrients. A good rule of thumb, if you have a pond that you're feeding, is don't give them any more food than what they can consume in about 5 minutes time. And if you do see uneaten feed floating on the surface, then you're feeding too much. A great resource on aquatic weeds is what's called Aquaplant. It's a online educational tool put out by Texas A&M University. I would say it's probably one of the best out there. So if you do have an issue, you have to identify what that plant is before you can do any control. You certainly don't want to buy a herbicide that will not work for the particular plant that you want. You'd be wasting your time and money. So proper identification is key. For homeowners that contact me, I'll have them send pictures, and then I can identify that and then make recommendations. But you can do a lot on your own, learning about plants and learning about control methods by using this resource. So take advantage of that. Another thing about ponds is it's best not to introduce fish that you may catch from another location. And the reason for that is you could be bringing in disease, for example. So I know a lot of pond owners, whatever their desired use is, that they are interested in possibly fishing, whether it be their family or grandchildren, whatever the case may be. So don't introduce wild fish. It just creates some issues. And then I mentioned briefly earlier when we talked about the oxygen cycling, is that aeration can be a really good tool, especially when you want a fish population, you want to maintain a healthy fish population, and in the case where you have elevated nutrients. Maybe there's activities going on in your watershed, or there's a pasture, whatever the case may be, and there are fertilizer inputs, and you can't reduce that. So aeration can help eliminate those dips or those low points during that daily cycle. So there's a lot of different types of aeration units out there, and I can certainly provide additional information on that. So I get this question a lot, whatever, if it's a farm pond, for example, hey, we'd like to use it for recreational fishing. What can we do? And so there, you can stock a pond. You just have to understand that that there are limitations here, and dependent upon all the desired uses of your pond, these numbers are just a guide here. You may want to certainly reduce the stocking rates if you're using the pond for other uses such as irrigation, for example, and you're getting a lot of water level swings because of, whether it's drought season or you're using a lot of water. So that might be one instance where you might not want to stock so heavy because the amount of water availability for the fish is limited during certain seasons. And then, when you're looking at what you can expect to harvest, this is just an example of 25 pounds of bass per year and up to 200 pounds of bluegill in a fertilized pond. Okay, this is actually when you're managing a pond rather, specifically for fish production, recreational fish production. Okay, and they're actually adding nutrients to the pond, and actually it's mostly in the form of phosphorus because that tends to be limiting in freshwater ponds. And then if you're not feeding all the various aquatic life that the fish feed on, then you can't expect to harvest a lot of fish in a pond. But again, it is an opportunity to manage for fish in a varied or multiple use type of farm pond. So I have a couple of resources here, websites that you can use. So if you do have an issue and you're thinking about maybe hiring somebody, MDA has a great searchable pesticide applicator list, and then they do have this category obviously for aquatics, so that is available. Maryland Department of Natural Resources actually does fish stocking for certain private pond owners, and so that's a resource to consider. And then there's also a great resource about geese management. So if you're having issues with geese, there's they go into a lot of detail on what you can do as a pond owner to try to manage for geese. Again, the big thing that we recommend is don't encourage geese because they are heavy nutrient contributors to ponds. And I'll close with just again some more information about just resources. You're affirming the AquaPlant resource that I mentioned here. Here's my email address. If you have a specific pond question or challenge that arises, feel free to contact me. We have some information on our website. I do a lot of water quality education, also focus on private drinking wells and septic systems, but there is a section in the pond management there if you're interested, and you'll have this recording as well. So again, utilize these resources. If you're interested in that beneficial native aquatic plant list, that's on the Maryland Sea Grant website. So with that, Lee, I'll take any questions that are out there.
Okay, see, I'm not seeing any right now, but I actually have a question for you. So I do some work with stormwater ponds with engineers and developers. So my question would be, a lot of times the sediment will build up in ponds, and I assume it's the same for farm ponds as well. How often would a pond maybe need to be cleaned out, and how would a landowner determine that need?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's another big challenge that I run into, because we have a lot of older, not only farm ponds, but even older stormwater ponds. And I'll take the stormwater part of this first, because stormwater ponds are designed to trap sediment as well as nutrients before they go into receiving streams and, ultimately the Chesapeake Bay. So they're designed to trap nutrients and sediment. In fact, some designs will have, it's a two pond system, a smaller 4-bay pond, they call it. And that's a shallow area to trap the sediments, and then the larger stormwater pond. And so, again, since they're designed to trap sediment, they can get filled up. And the challenge with any type of dredging, if you will, cleaning out a pond is, first off, what are you going to do with that sediment? And they're expensive. It's expensive to clean out a pond. In the case of a farm pond, and again, dependent upon its location and just how much organic matter is built up in the pond, which again is a problem because it's constantly releasing nutrients and feeding undesirable plants. And it's very difficult to do anything about that. Dredging is very expensive. And again, if you're on a farm, you may have a place where you could actually, utilize that sediment. Otherwise, in a stormwater pond, it's almost like hazardous waste disposal, and it again can be very, very challenging to try to resolve. So the thing about a farm pond is, again, try to reduce the amount of erosion on the watershed, and that's basically planting buffers along the shoreline, and that actually can apply to stormwater ponds as well. So again, try to reduce the amount of sediment and organics going in. Ponds that are near a lot of trees, for example, it's unavoidable. All that leaf litter over many decades can accumulate on the bottom. It's going through constant breakdown, bacterial breakdown, and it's releasing nutrients and things like that. So it's that's a challenging issue, dredging or cleaning out ponds. The one case where I have seen, particularly on farm ponds or recreational ponds, if it has a drain and they can drain a portion of the pond, maybe that helps for the sunlight actually to help oxidize the shoreline that's exposed and can actually break down some of that organic material. But again, to do that completely with a pond, you'd have to drain it, and then probably over a prolonged period, let the sun kind of work on it and help oxidize some of that organic matter. Or again, you could do partial removal.
Okay, thanks. We do have a question on here, and I'm not sure if you addressed this. I didn't hear it, but is there any mosquito control that can be provided with the fish in a pond?
Yeah, well, so the great thing about having fish, whatever species of fish, is the younger fish, even bluegill, for example, or brim, whatever, can feed on mosquito larvae. So typically, if you have let's say a new pond, whether it be a water garden or a small pond, it's beneficial to put some fish in there. There's actually a fish species called mosquito fish or gambusia, and they'll prey on mosquito larvae, but it's real important. Yeah, if you have standing water in a small pond, whatever situation, or leave a bowl of water outside in your backyard during the summer months, and you'll see how quickly mosquito larvae can populate it. But in a pond environment, yeah, there's a lot of fish species that will feed on mosquito larvae. Very important to have fish in a pond environment for that purpose.
We do have a question, I don't know if you see it, asking about the using this advice for mosquitoes in retention ponds.
Yeah, so retention being, typically when we speak about retention ponds, we're talking about permanent storage of water. A detention pond is kind of like more of a stormwater pond where there's flow through. But regardless, yes, you would want to have some fish in any type of pond, if only for the purpose of mosquito control. So the short answer is yes. I do see the chat.
Yeah, very good. Okay. All right. I think that's all the questions I see for now. We have it covered. So
yeah, just reemphasize, if I may, Lee, just contact me if there's issues. I get questions from farm pond owners often, particularly if they're using their pond for irrigation, and what type of filtration systems and aquatic vegetation control can be used in order to maintain ability to continue to irrigate. So, but happy to take any other questions that pop up in the future, and hope this information was helpful to you.
let me make sure I didn't miss something down here. This up. Got some coming in. Okay, no, I think we're good. All right, well, thank you so much, and thanks everyone for joining us. And make sure to keep tabs on the other webinars that are coming up on the link that I provided a little bit earlier for you, and have a good day. Thank you.